I've come to the floor, I think, along with a lot of other folks to talk about the healthcare in this country. And I think one of the goals we all share, we're maybe not sure how to get there, but one of the goals we all share is how to make sure that everybody who needs access to healthcare has it, and that it's affordable, and they get reasonably good quality, whoever they are and wherever they come from. When I was a naval flight officer, we used to fly a lot of missions out of Japan during the Cold War, and so I have a special interest in Japan, and they're very. I like the folks there, and they're pretty remarkable in what they do, what they've achieved over the years. And one of the things they've achieved over the years is providing pretty good health care at a fairly modest amount of money. And when we started working on the Affordable Care Act, 7, 8 years ago, one of the things I learned about Japan was that they were spending 8% of their gross domestic product, 8% of GDP for healthcare in their country. We were spending 18%. They were spending 8, we're spending 18. As it turns out, they're getting better results. They had lower rates of infant mortality, had higher rates of longevity. People live longer. Newborns died less frequently than we did. And then on top of all that, in Japan, they covered everybody. Everybody was covered for health care. We had about 40 million people, over 40 million people at the time, who had essentially their health care coverage was to get into an emergency room of a hospital and try to get in line and get some attention. So I've always said, I know how smart the Japanese are, but I don't think they can be that smart, and we can be that dumb. That's sort of where we were 6, 7 years ago. So we said, what are we going to do about it? Well, I think almost every president, maybe since Truman, has had a goal of making sure everybody in this country had access to health care. And a lot of folks talked about it, maybe tried to do something. And the first time we had a real serious effort to do that was during the Clinton administration, not led by President Bill Clinton, but actually led by our First Lady, Hillary Clinton. And what she came up with and worked on was something called Hillary Care. And the Republicans came up with an alternative to Hillary Care, introduced by a Republican senator from Rhode Island, John Chafee, a really good guy, very able guy. I actually served here with his son. Some of us served here with his son Lincoln in the U.S. Senate. And but in '93 and '94, when most people were focused on Hillary Care, John Chafee introduced legislation with roughly 20 or so Republican co-sponsors, a couple of whom are still here. I think Senator Orrin Hatch was one of them. I think Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa was one of them, and maybe a couple of Democrats as well. But 20 to 25 senators, mostly Republican, co-sponsored the Chafee legislation. And we have a chart here that mentions the Chafee bill, and there's a bunch of check marks on what was included in the Chafee legislation. One of the things that was included was the individual mandate, basically that everybody's got to get coverage. Second, employer mandate basically says employers have to provide health care coverage for their employees, maybe not for everyone, maybe not for the smallest businesses, but the idea was to get employers to meet what Senator Chafee and others of us think is an employer obligation or responsibility. There was in the Chafee legislation a ban on pre-existing conditions. And in the Chafee legislation, there were subsidies for purchasing insurance. Purchasing it where? Well, purchasing in state exchanges. The idea of creating large purchasing pools. And the folks who didn't have health care coverage could get their health care coverage in a large purchasing pool. If their income was low or relatively low, they'd be eligible for tax credits. It would buy down the cost of their health care coverage that they would get from the exchanges of the purchasing pools. Those were all ideas in Senator Chafee's legislation in 1993. And you know what? And I know I'm a Democrat, I probably shouldn't say this. I thought they all made sense. And the legislation in the end didn't go anywhere. The Hillary Care in the end didn't go anywhere. But long before we had a serious debate on the Affordable Care Act, people were talking about the same thing. And if you go over here to Romney Care in 2006, individual mandate, got it. Employer mandate, got it. Ban on pre-existing conditions, yep. Subsidies for purchasing insurance, yes. Establish state exchanges, purchasing groups, yes. Those were all in Romney Care. I've always given Governor Romney credit for the idea of the individual mandate, but apparently that was, I'm wrong, that was in Senator Chafee's legislation as well. So Governor Romney took the handoff, if you will, from Senator John Chafee and introduced, they call it Romney Care in Massachusetts, introduced it in 2006. When it first was introduced, they had a real good success in getting people covered. It was successful in terms of getting people covered. Where they were not so successful initially was affordability. And they had to work on affordability. Part of their problem there was it took a while for the healthier, younger people who didn't really think they needed health care coverage because they were young and invincible. It took a while for them to start, finally said, this fine keeps going up year after year after year, and maybe I should get some health care coverage and not pay the fine. And ultimately, I think the Romney Care did a much better job on affordability. Well, if you take these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 key provisions: individual mandate, employer mandate, ban on pre-existing conditions, subsidies for purchasing insurance, and establishing the state exchanges. Key provisions in the Chafee bill, they're in Romney Care. Believe it or not, they're in the Affordable Care Act. And I know some of our Republican friends think that nobody listened to them. And when we wrote the Affordable Care Act, well, actually, these are your ideas. These are your ideas, and some of the provisions or aspects of the Affordable Care Act that they've been our friends across the aisle have been most critical of are things that were originally their idea. Do I think that? And then we changed the thing as Senator Sanders has joined us on the floor. We added to that. We expanded Medicaid. And at least we said to states, we didn't make them expand Medicaid, but he said if you do, the federal government will pay the lion's share of the increased cost in Medicaid. I think initially maybe 24 states signed up and said, we'll do that, including the District of Columbia. And later on, another 7 or so, 8 states. I think Indiana is one of those that decided to, under Governor Pence, decided to expand Medicaid up to about roughly 135% of poverty, from maybe closer to 100% of poverty for most states. That is a little bit of a little bit of history lesson. I want to say maybe we got another chart here that we can look at. I want to find a pie chart. And Sylvia Matthews Burwell came by, and Secretary of Health and Human Services came by a month or two ago and talked to our Democratic Senate caucus. And one of the things that she said to us, I thought was especially informative, was that she talked about this a pie chart. And what she said is that, think of this pie chart, and it includes about 300 million people, Americans, that get health care, at least those who get some kind of health care other than emergency room. And she told us that roughly half, maybe a little bit more than half of the 300 million people in this, among the Americans that are getting health care coverage, a little over half, 57%, get their coverage through really employer coverage. The employers provide that as a condition of employment. Another roughly 22%, that's this area, sort of the brown area, is Medicaid and the SCHIP program, the Children's Health Insurance Program, and a bipartisan idea. Bill Roth worked on that, the Clintons and all worked on that, others. I even worked on it as governor. And about 15%, this area right here, the green, is Medicare. And then you've got down here the individual markets, the marketplaces and so forth. And there's roughly 5 or 6% down here where people are getting their coverage. A lot of the attention, a lot of the criticism of the delivery of health care in the last 6, 7 years by our friends on the other side has been down here with the marketplaces, the exchanges, with the sliding scale tax rate. Those were their ideas. One of the nice things about the Affordable Care Act that it's done, not many people know this, but the Medicare Trust Fund, which is in danger of running out of money, the life of the trust fund has been extended by 12 years because of the Affordable Care Act. The Medicaid pieces have been Secretary of Health and Human Services, Sylvia Matthews Burwell, was negotiated with a number of governors to try to give them the opportunity to sort of customize their Medicaid programs. And I think maybe in Indiana they wanted to have like a copay, a small copay, for the people who are participating in Medicare, and that's what they got. So they're not all one size fits all, but there's some differentiation between Medicaid. Now we have roughly 2/3 of the states have signed up on Medicaid expansion, and so that's just a little visual. Wait, do we have another chart here? Let's see if we have another chart here. Question: who gets hurt by repealing the Affordable Care Act? If we just repeal the Affordable Care Act, we don't replace it. At the same time, we repeal it or change it. A lot of people get hurt. including a lot of people that are in exchanges and are getting health care coverage maybe for the first time in a long time. But actually, folks who are not in the exchanges, people who get their health care coverage in all kinds of ways, including employer-provided Medicare and Medicaid, or privately paid. Hurts us all. We don't need the kind of uncertainty, lack of predictability that would be created by a repeal without having a very clear picture of what we're going to replace it with at the same time. Not a year from now, not 2 years, not 3 years, not 4 years from now, at the same time. That's what we ought to do. My dad, I'll close with this. I know one of my colleagues from a big state up to the northeast of us has a few things he wants to say, and I welcome hearing him. But my dad used to say to my sister and me when we were kids growing up, a little younger than our pages, he used to say to my sister and me, we'd do some boneheaded stunt. And he would say to my sister and me, just use some common sense. That's what he'd say. Just use some common sense. He said it a lot. We must not have had much. Well, just repealing the Affordable Care Act and not having something to replace it with immediately that provides coverage just as good, affordable, comprehensive coverage, that would not be a very good common sense. We can do better than that. We can do better than that. I hope that our Republican friends with this rush to judgment to repeal and replace 2 or 3, 4 years down the line, I hope they'll come around and say, nah, that doesn't make much sense. And they'll listen to some of their colleagues and some of the rest of us that says, if we're going to repeal the Affordable Care Act, let's know what we're going to replace it with. Make sure that we do that on day one.